December 1944. A forward outpost near the Sauer River, Luxembourg. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. The temperature is well below freezing, and ice clings to the jagged remains of a shattered pine forest. A lone sentinel stands in a shallow trench, his fingers frozen to the steel receiver of his M1 Garand rifle, staring blindly into the black void of the Ardennes. The rest of his squad is asleep in a dark cellar 40 yards behind him. Oblivious to the biting wind, sudden footsteps crunch softly on the frozen crust of snow just feet away, cutting through the silence. A massive silhouette appears from the darkness, accompanied by a small staff. The young sentinel gasps, nearly dropping his weapon in the blinding cold, as he recognizes the unmistakable silhouette of a high-ranking officer. This is the moment a legendary commander discovers a forgotten boy at the edge of the world and delivers a lesson in duty that nobody present will ever forget. This is the story of what Patton did at 3 a.m. when he found a 19-year-old private standing guard alone for 6 hours. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the kindness that outranked every order. Private, First Class Danny Reeves was 19 years old. He came from a small, quiet farm in rural Alabama, where the dirt was red and the summers were long. Before enlisting, he spent his mornings plowing fields and his evenings sitting on the porch with his family. He had been in the European theater for exactly 3 months, arrived as a replacement, and had already seen 2 close friends die in a muddy ditch outside Metz. He carried a small, faded photograph of his mother in his left breast pocket, right against his skin. On this freezing night, his boots were soaked through, his feet were entirely numb, and he had been on his feet for 22 straight hours, without a moment of rest. He stayed on that frozen ridge because he knew that if he walked away, the men sleeping below would never wake up. Sergeant Donald Miller was 34 years old and hailed from a comfortable suburb in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was a veteran of the North African Campaign, serving with the 80th Infantry Division, and wore a clean, tailored winter coat that smelled of fresh laundry. Miller believed that a veteran sergeant had earned the right to let the new replacements shoulder the brutal, freezing night work, while the senior men preserved their energy for the daytime advance. He often told the platoon that the Green Boys needed to be broken in by the elements if they ever expected to survive the real fighting. On this night, Miller occupied the warmest corner of the deep stone cellar, wrapped tightly in 2 wool blankets near a small smoking stove. He had fallen asleep hours ago, leaving a single 19-year-old replacement to guard the dark perimeter without a backup plan. The Allied advance across Western Europe had ground into a brutal, frozen standstill by the final weeks of 1944. The German military had just launched a massive, unexpected counteroffensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes, catching the overextended American lines completely by surprise. Divisions were fractured, communication lines were shattered by artillery, and small units found themselves isolated in remote villages and icy outposts along the river crossings. The weather was the worst Europe had seen in half a century, with heavy snow blankets blinding scouts and sub-zero winds freezing vehicle engines solid. Supply lines were choked miles to the rear, leaving frontline infantrymen short on ammunition, heavy winter clothing, and hot food. In the chaos of this sudden winter crisis, local commanders were forced to make desperate adjustments, often pushing their men far past the limits of human endurance just to hold a single snowy ridge. Under the crushing weight of these conditions, the standard military protocols regarding guard rotations and frontline relief began to break down across the sector. Many mid-level officers and senior non-commissioned officers, exhausted by weeks of continuous movement, looked the other way when fatigue corrupted the standard routines. They allowed schedules to slip, assuming that the sheer brutality of the weather would keep the enemy at bay, or that a few extra hours on watch would not break a young soldier. It was an unspoken compromise born of exhaustion, an accumulation of small negligences that occurred every night across the frozen line. Most senior commanders remained blocks away in heated chateaus, relying on paper reports and maps while the reality of the cold remained invisible to them. But the absolute strain on the individual infantrymen at the furthest outposts was reaching a dangerous breaking point. Lieutenant Thomas Vance, a 26-year-old officer from Columbus, Ohio, walked into the cold cellar. He shone a flashlight onto the stone floor, checking the positions. He found the sergeant sitting near the stove, wrapping a blanket tight around his chest. Vance pulled his collar up. He looked at the roster on his clipboard. He noticed the time on his wristwatch. It was past 3 in the morning. He looked down at the sergeant. "Are you aware of the situation on the ridge?" Vance said. The sergeant did not look up from the small stove. "The boys are handling the perimeter," Miller said. "Reeves has been out there for 6 hours straight," Vance said. "He is learning how the infantry works," Miller said. "The relief man is burning with a fever in the back room," Vance said. "Then the boy will have to stay put until sunrise," Miller said. "The regulation requires a fresh sentinel every 2 hours in sub-zero weather," Vance said. "Regulations do not fight the winter in Luxembourg," Miller said. "You are leaving a 19-year-old replacement alone in the dark." Vance said the Green Boys need the seasoning if they want to survive the push, Miller said. "He has been awake for 22 hours without a warm meal," Vance said. "He will appreciate his breakfast a lot more when he gets it," Miller said. "This is not training, Sergeant. This is neglect," Vance said. "I have survived 3 campaigns by knowing when to rest my primary staff," Miller said. "You are willfully violating the frontline safety protocol," Vance said. "The replacements are here to take the heavy weight off the veterans," Miller said. "I am ordering you to wake up a fresh man right now," Vance said. "There are no fresh men in this cellar," Miller said. "Then you take the rifle and relieve him yourself," Vance said. "A sergeant does not stand a replacement watch in the middle of a freeze," Miller said. "You are refusing a direct order from a superior officer," Vance said. "I am managing the survival of this squad according to my own experience," Miller said. "This conversation is going on the official record," Vance said. "Go ahead and write the report, Lieutenant," Miller said. Vance turned toward the wooden stairs, his boots clicking on the stone. He climbed out of the cellar and walked directly to the radio terminal in the command tent. He grabbed the handset, requested a priority patch, and demanded to speak with the senior duty officer at the regional headquarters. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His Jeep pulled up to the gate with 4 stars shining on the wet metal bumper, and ivory revolvers strapped tightly to his waist. The driver cut the engine, and the general walked into the stone cellar completely unannounced. The men instantly froze, staring at the polished helmet and the sharp crease of his wool trousers. Patton stood near the small wood stove, looking down at the comfortable blankets. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry. He simply focused on the veteran sergeant. "Are you the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for this sector?" Patton said. "I am Sergeant Miller, sir," he said. "Did you assign Private Reeves to the frontline watch tonight?" Patton said. "Yes, General, I did," Miller said. "How long has that 19-year-old boy been standing in the sub-zero mud?" Patton said. 6 hours, sir," Miller said. "Did you know his relief was incapacitated with a fever?" Patton said. "I did, General," Miller said. "Why did you leave him on the perimeter for 4 extra hours?" Patton said. "The replacements need the seasoning, sir, and I had to preserve my primary assets," Miller said. Patton studied him for a silent moment. "You believe your veteran status gives you the privilege of sleeping in a warm cellar while a green boy carries the survival of this entire unit on his frozen shoulders. You think a replacement is an expendable shield designed to keep you comfortable in the dark. You are mistaken. An army does not exist to serve the comfort of its senior non-commissioned officers. A real leader does not preserve his own assets by throwing a 19-year-old child into a frozen ditch for 6 straight hours. While you slept under 2 wool blankets near a smoking stove, that boy was fighting the entire German army with frozen fingers and an empty stomach. He has been awake for 22 hours doing the job you were too lazy to organize. Your experience is no longer an asset to the United States Army. It is a liability. You have forgotten the fundamental rule of command, which dictates that the comfort of the officer comes last. You have a choice. You can take your rifle and stand that exact ridge until the sunrise, or you can face an immediate general court-martial for willful neglect of duty in a combat zone. Decide now. Miller stared at the floor, his face turning pale. "I will take the watch, General," he said. Lieutenant Vance moved quickly under the dim cellar light, stepping toward the shivering sergeant. He handed Miller his heavy M1 Garand rifle, the cold steel clicking sharply against the brass buttons of his wool coat. The other soldiers in the crowded room watched in absolute silence, none of them daring to breathe as the veteran sergeant slowly climbed the wooden stairs. Miller stepped out into the black night, the sub-zero wind immediately cutting through his tailored winter uniform and stinging his bare face. He walked up the steep, icy ridge, his boots sliding against the frozen crust of snow, until he reached the shallow, dark trench. Private Reeves stood there waiting, his entire body shaking so hard that he could barely keep his hands steady. Miller took the position without saying a single word, grabbing the perimeter line as the young replacement turned back toward the camp. The men back at the command post watched from the shadows of the tents, seeing a veteran sergeant forced to hold a freezing watch in the mud. The biting air smelled of sulfur and wet pine, and the distant crump of artillery echoed across the Sauer River. Miller scanned the empty darkness alone, his hands growing numb within minutes, realizing exactly what he had forced a 19-year-old boy to endure for 6 straight hours. Private First Class Danny Reeves returned to rural Alabama in the late autumn of 1945. He settled down on the family farm, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 3 children in a house built from local pine. He rarely talked about the freezing nights along the Sauer River, but he kept a small photograph of his old squad hidden in a wooden drawer near his bed. Every December, his hands would shake when the first frost hit the red dirt fields, a physical reminder of the hours spent on the ridge. He lived a quiet, industrious life as a deacon in the local church, and died of natural causes in the summer of 1993. Sergeant Donald Miller faced a reduction in rank following the frontline investigation in Luxembourg. He remained with the infantry until the German surrender, serving out his remaining months in a rearguard supply depot far from the active combat lines. He returned to Philadelphia in 1946, working as a clerk for a regional railroad company until his retirement 30 years later. He lived out his final years in a quiet suburban home, harboring a deep bitterness toward the wartime bureaucracy that had stripped him of his authority. He passed away in the winter of 1981, never mentioning the name of George Patton to his family. General Patton wrote a brief entry in his personal diary on the morning following his visit to the river outpost. He noted that a commander must always look at the shoes and the stomach of the furthest sentinel before he checks the maps at headquarters. He believed that an army was only as strong as the single soldier holding the dark perimeter at 3 o'clock in the morning. Some historians have argued that Patton's severe response to frontline negligence was an unnecessary display of theatrical discipline during a chaotic winter crisis. They claim that reducing a veteran campaign sergeant's rank over a single scheduling error undermined the established authority structure at a moment when units needed continuity. Others have argued the opposite, defending the general's actions as a vital correction that preserved frontline morale and protected vulnerable replacements from systemic abuse. They maintain that true leadership requires absolute accountability, regardless of rank or prior service records. What is certain is that the record of the surprise inspection remained a permanent warning to every officer throughout the Third Army. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply issued a private warning to the sergeant? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the kindness that outranked every order, make sure to subscribe.